the central government has given no indication so far that they're actually going to scrap any of these COVID controls. And that's leading to a lot of anger and confusion among local authorities as well about what to do. Do they continuing follow their own rules about keeping people under lockdown and doing mass testing despite these protests? Or do they kind of just throw up their hands and give up? China is at a tipping point right now.
Now for a look at politics from further afield, and protesters in China are demanding the end of communist rule in rare demonstrations in several cities. It's after 10 people died in a fire at flats in the northwest of the country on Thursday.
Some are questioning whether strict COVID quarantine rules stop residents from escaping, something the authorities are denying. Well, let's get the latest on the situation from Emily Feng, National Public Radio's Beijing correspondent. Emily Feng, thank you very much indeed for being with us. First of all, how widespread and serious are these protests?
Well, they're all over the country. They began in Urumqi, where those fires you just mentioned began, but then they spread to Shanghai, and then they've popped up on streets and university campuses in Beijing, the political capital. And then today, for example, I was following these protests that were happening at Tsinghua University, a very prestigious university and the alma mater of China's leader Xi Jinping. And students there were protesting in the hundreds, shouting that they wanted rule of law and democracy. So you've seen how they've ballooned from demands for the end of COVID controls to systemic changes to the political system that have made these lockdowns possible. Now, where do these protests go, I think is what you're asking. And unfortunately, you're starting to see them fizzle out already a little bit as police make arrests, as they take down protest videos online. But in some ways, they've already had limited success in the sense that some lockdowns have been lifted, buildings that don't have active COVID cases now have been quote unquote liberated. People can come and go. And there are still small scale protests happening all around the country.
I've read that in some areas, people who broke COVID restrictions were actually threatened by the authorities with summary execution. Is that the case?
I have not heard that, but breaking COVID rules is a criminal offense. So if you are stopped by police and you, for example, don't have the right test, or you break your lockdown regulations, you can be thrown into prison for that. And there have been restaurant owners that have gone to prison because they have not shown that they're following COVID regulations and, say, making sure people who come in have their proper negative COVID tests before they eat.
Emily, how long do you think this kind of restrictive COVID rule system can go on for? Surely not forever, or is that the intention here?
Well, that's the question, right? What is the end game of zero COVID? At the beginning, it was incredibly popular, and that should not be overlooked because people did not know how this coronavirus worked. They didn't know how to protect themselves. But unfortunately, all that goodwill has been squandered, and there hasn't been an end goal for what they think zero COVID should ultimately be. I mean, I think the promise was that there'd be these huge upfront costs, but one day these COVID controls would end because the government would find some way to vaccinate its population and to prepare public health measures to gradually open up like the rest of the world. But there has been absolutely none of that. There was a little bit of a sign that China was relaxing some points of its zero COVID policy earlier this month, and that's what gave people hope that there was some kind of light at the end of the tunnel. But all of a sudden this week, COVID cases rose and lockdowns came back, and that's why you're seeing this frustration now. But the central government has given no indication so far that they're actually going to scrap any of these COVID controls. And that's leading to a lot of anger and confusion among local authorities as well about what to do. Do they continuing follow their own rules about keeping people under lockdown and doing mass testing despite these protests? Or do they kind of just throw up their hands and give up? China is at a tipping point right now.
And you mentioned vaccination there. I mean, where is China in terms of vaccinating its population?
It's actually quite high. I mean, they have vaccination rates of up to 80-90% in many places. Their elderly vaccination rate is above 60% now, which is not super high, but it's better than where they were a year ago. But that's not really, that's not just that's not the full picture. That's just one thing that they need to focus on. They also need to work on having enough emergency beds for when they open up and making sure they have enough medical facilities to take care of people as COVID cases increase. So they are really at a difficult point where they haven't made the adequate preparations to completely open up, and yet their COVID controls have gone on for so long that their own people are not supportive anymore.
It's also the case, isn't it, that the Sinovac vaccination is not as effective as Pfizer and some of the Western vaccinations, and particularly against these strains of Omicron.
It is not completely as effective. It's pretty effective, but it's not as effective as some Western vaccines. And China has been slow to let Western vaccines in. But again, that's vaccines are just one part of the picture. They've got to figure out ways to psychologically message to people that it's okay to get COVID, that you're not going to die. Unfortunately, also people associate COVID with being sent to a government quarantine facility in China. And so there's still a lot of fear about contracting it. And that public fear often is just as damaging as the disease itself. So there are many, many things that China unfortunately has not done to prepare to open up. But at the same time, with the cost of zero COVID that we're seeing in the country, it's also untenable to keep zero COVID forever. And so they've created a bind for themselves, and there's no easy way out right now.
You mentioned that fear that people feel. I mean, is that something that is unique to China at the moment? That people themselves are very worried about catching COVID. Do they want to end this lockdown? Most people, the majority, or are they in some ways, very afraid of what happens when that does end?
Well, there's a mixture. Most people want lockdowns to end, and those are the people that you see going out and protesting. And part of the reason that they're coming out is because they're getting information from other countries, from watching the World Cup, for example, and seeing people go to games unmasked, that actually the variants that are going on right now are not as severe as the original variants that were happening before, and that with vaccines and proper healthcare, people can overcome this virus. But there are still people who have this residual fear, and they've been told for almost the last 3 years that if you get COVID, you can have very, very serious health consequences. People are genuinely terrified of long COVID and the after effects of COVID, even after you recover. And then I think the biggest fear is just the social cost, because having COVID in China carries with it such an immense burden of being quarantined, of having everyone around you quarantined, and everyone in your building quarantined, that just the social stigma of having it is also very strong.
Emily Feng, thank you for taking us through that this morning.